Literary critics have invented a host of phrases and concepts to separate artists from their art. By far the best known is the death of the author, which comes from a 1967 essay by Roland Barthes. Essentially, the notion is to imagine that the author cannot be asked for their intent or how their own life experiences shaped their writing, so the theorist's interpretation is at least as valid as the author's intention, provided said interpretation is reasonably derived from the text. While that's a worthwhile literary exercise, there can be a problem that comes from many people knowing pieces of writing through cultural osmosis instead of actually reading the text. Instead, sometimes there are aspects of the text that simply aren't as haunting as the passages in stories that become touchstones. This means that interpretations of stories can actually be demonstrably incorrect. And in the video today, we're looking at 10 such things. Number 10. The Hunchback of Notre Dame. When the 1995 Disney adaptation of this movie came out, many critics and audience members were united in decrying the supposed borderline desecration of the original story. They pointed to the 1939 or 1920 versions of the story as proper adaptations which properly portrayed the unsavory nature of Quasimodo, as well as the tragic fate of the gypsy Esmeralda, the clergyman Claude Frollo, and so on. It was a criticism completely undermined by how Victor Hugo wrote the original 1831 version of the story. As Lindsay Ellis explains in a highly recommendable video essay, in the original novel, Quasimodo is a mere bit part and certainly not a sympathetic figure. There's no tragic romance with the gypsy Esmeralda, who it turns out was actually a Caucasian abandoned as a child. In brief, Hugo didn't write his novel as a tragedy, so much as a tribute to the cathedral itself, which at the time of writing was less a French institution than a wreck that had been vandalized numerous times over the centuries and left neglected. That Hugo's sympathies were with the building over the people who lived in it and around it is much less surprising to anyone who knows that the original title was Notre Dame de Paris. Perhaps that theme would resonate with misanthropic architecture students, but it certainly wouldn't have been the crowd pleaser many subsequent adaptations have been. Number 9. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Washington Irving's story, set in a Dutch community in 1790s New York, loosely based on real events, is about a schoolteacher named Ichabod Crane. Crane gets chased by a headless horseman across a bridge. When the horseman can't catch him, he throws a pumpkin at Crane. Those who read an abridged version in class might remember that it was heavily implied that Brom Bones was pretending to be the headless Hessian horseman to scare off Crane so that he could marry Katerina Van Tassel without any competition from superstitious schoolteachers. Considering Ichabod disappears and Bones gets what he wants through pretty underhanded and aggressive means, it seems like this slice of Americana should be a pretty dark, spooky tale where the villain wins in the end, be he a ghost or a tough local guy in disguise. Readers have that impression because many of them lost track of how odious a person Irving wrote Ichabod Crane to be. Like many schoolteachers of the time, Crane is described as having romantic interest purely for financial reasons. Irving explicitly describes him as looking at her father's fortune with green eyes. He's also explicitly a mooch and a glutton, only getting away with it because he knows a lot of local ghost lore. The story also ends with a postscript noting that there was talk in Sleepy Hollow that Crane was seen again later, having moved to another community and became a judge. However, the locals rejected that because his supposed disappearance made for a better story. If anything, Irving went overboard in assuring audiences not to worry about old Ichabod. Number 8. Jabberwocky. Lewis Carroll's titular monster, which was first introduced to readers in Alice Through the Looking Glass, has been portrayed as a serious beast in such adaptations as the 1985 movie. Even those who know better than to portray such serious versions of the monsters from the poem assume that slithy toves and more wraths from the opening verse mean unidentifiable beasts, such as in the version done for The Muppet Show. Jabberwocky's origin was in 1855 in a magazine called Mishmash, which had a circulation of Lewis Carroll's immediate family. It was not only meant as a parody of folk poems, but he actually handily explained what all those words meant, so those terms aren't so much nonsense as code. For example, sleevey toves aren't actually cheese-eating badgers. Moraths are turtles. Brillig is said to be the early afternoon as it refers to the time of broiling dinner. All things considered, the opening verse is much closer to a slightly offbeat version of Wind in the Willows than it is a surreal menagerie of cryptids. Number 7. Harrison Bergeron. In Kurt Vonnegut's 1961 short story, equality is perverted so that every exceptional person is limited to be no better than the worst performing person, either by restraints that weigh them down or by zapping them if they think too much. This idea has been embraced by right-wing publications like National Review. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia cited it in a ruling requiring tournament golfers to walk between shots. What they don't seem to notice is the portrayal of the eponymous character. As critics have more recently pointed out, Bergeron is a ridiculously overpowered human being who not only stands 7 feet tall at age 14, but is also literally capable of flying as he dances. More revealingly, he proclaims himself emperor, which probably isn't something Vonnegut would have a heroic character do. He also makes this declaration and displays his powers on live television, which of course means that the handicapped General Diana Moon Glampus would have no trouble hunting him down and shooting him, as she does seemingly effortlessly in the story. Clearly, Bergeron is a parody of the Howard Rourke and John Galt type Supermen that are so perfect and so underappreciated in Ayn Rand's novels. Considering Vonnegut's left-wing views throughout his writing career, it's subjectivism that's in his sights at least as much as socialism. Number 6. The Satanic Verses. When it was published in 1988, author Salman Rushdie struck free publicity gold when his book was interpreted as blasphemous and banned in India while the Ayatollah demanded his head. He surely didn't celebrate this, as he had to go into hiding from very real threats. Several translators of the book were attacked, one fatally. Considering that the book is a formidable 600 pages long, it's not so surprising that many people didn't read the entire story and were content to go off a vague sense of what the novel was about, or a heavily abridged version. The Satanic Verses tells the intertwined stories of two Southeast Asian Muslims, one born wealthy and the other poor. The pair both survive a plane crash, and the rich one becomes cursed while the other becomes angelic. Still, the rich one survives the novel while the other commits suicide while wanted for murder. He is unambiguously responsible for several deaths. The offending portions of the book are a secondary narrative of a few dozen pages about the rise of the prophet Mahound. The Satanic Verses of the title are an allusion to a claim by the prophet that for some contradictory statements he made, it must have been Satan pretending to be Allah. In a manner that paralleled a scene that offended many in The Last Temptation of Christ, Rushdie styled his parody of the prophet as a very elaborate dream sequence to give him plausible deniability that he was portraying an in-universe fictional version. The version many Muslims were given, however, only showed the dream sequence without the larger context, and so inevitably it misled many on the intent of the book. Number 5. Valley of the Dolls. These days, the 1966 novel is better known for selling 40 million copies than it is for its contents. It's the story of 3 women who try to enter show business, but run into such pitfalls as creative compromise, sexual exploitation, and drug addiction. The dolls of the title are the upper and downer pills. This book was salacious for its time, and it couldn't help but become one of literally the best-selling books of all time. No wonder it got a couple of film adaptations, a much-derided smash hit in 1968 and a TV movie in 1981. An aspect of the literary juggernaut that for decades was held up as the impetus for its success was the titulation of guessing which characters were modeled on which specific real people. For example, was the character that had a pill addiction Judy Garland? Was the over-the-hill singer who stands in the protagonist's way based on Ethel Merman? Well, according to Jacqueline Susan, the answer to all of those guesses was no, and that all the characters were invented to fit a theme instead of to reveal the truth behind a real entertainer's persona. She eventually said of the misconception, "Let them think that. It sells more of my books." Number 4. Dracula. Bram Stoker's 1987 classic is not just one of the 2 most influential horror novels of the 19th century, alongside Frankenstein. For many outside Central or Eastern Europe, it was the popularity of Dracula that led them to learn of the 15th century Romanian ruler Vladislav III, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Deposed early in life, Vlad fought against both the Ottoman Empire and fellow Romanians and eventually died in battle, but not before leaving behind battlefields laden with impaled prisoners of war in an attempt to demoralize his enemies. Such a person seems tailor-made to inspire a monster in human shape, which completely misunderstands Stoker's real writing process. There is no evidence that he studied Vlad the Impaler's life for inspiration. In fact, there's no evidence that he even knew this man existed. In 1890, the year he began working on the book, he noted that he read a book on Westphalia and came across the word Dracula, but he misinterpreted it as being the local word for evil. While Vlad is from approximately the same area of Europe as Dracula, Vlad was certainly not much associated with Transylvania, which would have been a key connection to invoking the memory of the historical figure. In short, Stoker seemed to have more lucked into the historical echoes than anything else. Number 3. The Great Gatsby. Nearly 80 years after its initial disappointing release in 1925, F. Scott Fitzgerald's Jazz Age triumph sells roughly 500,000 copies a year. It's resonated with readers enough to make its way to the silver screen in 1926, 1949, 1976, and 2013. Each release was greeted with a critical thrashing and to very mixed results at the box office. But that's not to say readers who generally regard themselves as more astute than movie fans don't mistake Fitzgerald's intention with Gatsby. As explained by Sarah Churchwell in The Guardian, most people misinterpret Gatsby as being a suave charmer. There are a few telling descriptions that undermine this, though. His pink suits, which were tacky even in the Roaring Twenties, and his bewilderment in the face of the high society that narrator Nick Carraway takes for granted. That's why he overcompensates for his parties, doing such things as hiring entire orchestras. Gatsby is a dreamer pining for a fantasy version of life from his youth. He's not a man with his feet on the ground in the present. Not that this dissonance is anything new, though. Fitzgerald wrote back in the day that of all the reviews, even the most enthusiastic, not one has the slightest idea what the book was about. Number 2. Don Quixote. It's been just over 400 years since Miguel de Cervantes' masterpiece was first published in English. Since then, the image of a nobleman putting a washing basin on his head, taking a nag for a noble steed, and his trusty assistant Sancho Panza on a number of delusional, pointless quests in an attempt to restore chivalry to the land has only become more poignant. Don Quixote is both absurd and lovable, and many readers have mixed feelings about the ending, where he regains his sanity enough to dictate in his will that his niece be disinherited if she marries a man who reads books of chivalry. As recounted in the New York Times, the title character actually comes across as much less sympathetic when you really look at the text. While Quixote means well, Cervantes does not skimp on the details of the pain he causes. This is not just to his assistant Sancho Panza, who gets beat up because Quixote doesn't pay a hotel bill, but even mules that can't drink from their water trough because Quixote insists the water is holy. It is a detail of the story that is understandably omitted from adaptations such as The Man of La Mancha, which contributed to those interpretations being dismissed as kitsch. Number 1. SlaughterhouseFive. Well, when an author writes as many famous, satirical, morally complex, and whimsical stories as Kurt Vonnegut did, it's not surprising that he'd have multiple works end up on lists like this. So it is with his 1969 anti-war classic about a World War II veteran named Billy Pilgrim. This book is about Pilgrim's subjective experience of his life, and it jumps back and forward through time. Within the intro of the book, Vonnegut quotes an associate who asked authors writing anti-war books why they didn't instead write an anti-glacier book. This, of course, is meaning that the human tendency towards war is as implacable as glaciers. A similar sentiment is expressed by the alien race called the Tralfamadorians, who consider their own atrocities and eventual destruction of the universe as utterly inevitable because they can see the entirety of all the time they live all at once. Hence, many have viewed it as a pro-fatalism book, as they wonder whether the events of the book are real or not. The text makes explicit that the aliens don't exist. Within the book, the aliens Billy Pilgrim meets and the environments they place him in, specifically a zoo, are described as something he read in a novel by a hack sci-fi author, Kilgore Trout. Further, Pilgrim does not express anything to anyone else about the aliens until after a plane crash that leaves him unconscious, i.e. likely with brain damage and trauma. As Michael Carson of wrathbearingtree.com points out, when Pilgrim first discusses the lessons he supposedly learned about the inevitability of war and the atrocities that come from it, it's with a warhawk named Rumford, who Vonnegut mocks. Pilgrim merely echoes Rumford and then says he learned all of what Rumford told him on Tralfamador. On the other hand, Vonnegut also makes it explicit that the Tralfamadorians believe they will eventually destroy the universe. Vonnegut's message isn't that war and atrocities are inevitable, but to follow this philosophy makes its adherents into puppets and leads to disaster for everyone. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. If you're looking for something else to watch right now, though, why not check out one of our other videos linked to on the screen. And as always, thank you for watching.